I'm Eric. This video is a bit different from previous ones. The other day I recorded myself adding a new way to register IPC handlers in Pewter and migrating the launchApp function to be exposed in this way. This is also a good example of enabling incremental changes to avoid a large refactor when it isn't necessary. This PR, number 723, describes the current way launchApp works and the changes I'd like to make to it. It provides additional context that might make this video easier to understand. Alright, past Eric, take the wheel. Okay, let's try this again. OBS was throwing error messages at me. I want to move IPC into a service, but instead of moving it into a service, what I'm actually going to do is make a registry for IPC handlers and expose that in a service that calls itself the IPC service. But really all the code for IPC that presently exists I'm going to keep here. And then somewhere before this chain of if-else's where we check events, which starts here, I'm just going to do a for loop through all the declarative IPC handlers. And then if there isn't one in there, I'm going to let it proceed with the logic that's already there. This IPC handlers registry is going to have the name of some handler, the event name that will be given to the post message as it normally would. What's useful about this is we can also model the parameters. So for example, instead of doing specific handling to say this parameter is valid, that parameter is valid, we can have different types of parameters and just say what the type of each parameter is, but I don't need to even do that right away, so I'm not even going to do that yet either. This just opens the door for that to be done in the future. For launchApp, we have app instance ID and app name and some arguments, and we want to get this child instance ID and send it back to the caller. Right now this happens through an interesting chain of events where we register the ID of the callback we have, which is launch message ID. We put it in child launch callbacks, and then we call launchApp, which calls a helper function, which reads that and finds the thing that we put in that object so that it can send the message along to the caller, so pewter.js inside of an app, and then it's going to create an app connection object and return that to the callback. And it actually does a similar thing here where it registers an ID, and then this is something that will be common across all registered all IPC handlers that are registered with the registry above that I mentioned, but we don't need to put anything here because we can actually use the cross document RPC, pewter.util.rpc. We can use that to handle passing things back and forth between the iframe, and we don't need to manually add registrants every time we handle something like that. That can all happen in one place, that being cross-document RPC. One thing that's common with all IPC messages that come from iframes is that app instance ID must be present. So that will be handled for all the declarative IPC handlers as well. Let me just get back to launchApp here. So in this case we wouldn't explicitly be passing this around. Instead because launchApp was registered that way, it's going to get an app instance ID in some consistent way that will be true for everything that's registered in there. Yeah. So, let's get started. LaunchApp is going to be here. It's going to have a handle method, but it's not going to be registered right here. It's going to be registered as a service. Right now, services are launched in init GUI, but where it is at, that's at the top here. But that will instead be moved up to an init system, and in init GUI, we'll instead, where do we call launch services? Instead of calling launch services here, it would be something like a global init system, and which would be called system P, I think, because like system D. It would be system P, and then it would be like emit sysinit, something like that. This is the earliest stage at which a service can be initialized. That's the idea of what that would mean, and this is what will cause those to be launched. But then we might have another emit in UI desktop after the GUI is loaded. So we might do something like await global this system P emit desktop, something like that. I'm not going to do that right away either, because I don't need to right now, but that's the general idea. Is that going to go? Okay, there we go. That always delays for some reason. Yeah. So let's go back to launch services, which is at the top here. We're going to register a service, register IPC, new IPC service, but we don't have an IPC service yet. That's going to go in services. I'm going to type theme service and open that just so VS Code goes where I want it to go, and I'm going to add IPC service. And I'm going to just put theme service over there for reference because there are a few small deviations between the service architecture and backend. Let's see, this is IPC service, and it extends service. One thing I like about the GUI implementation of this is I called the base class service instead of base service, which is just much nicer. So we can have an init. We might not use that, actually. What we're going to do is we're going to provide a method to register an IPC handler. And that is going to have a name and a specification. The specification is going to be that object with a handle method that I mentioned earlier. And right now, all IPC service is going to do, let's go back to ipc.js. All it's going to do is call it's going to access window.ipc handlers, and it's going to add it there. Now we could, of course, wherever we wanted to, just do this instead of calling register IPC handler on IPC service. But now if there's anything we want to do when an IPC handler is registered, we can do that, and we can change this implementation if maybe we don't want to store them in a map like this, or maybe we need to emit an event to let something know an IPC handler has been registered in the future. Who knows what will happen. But this accomplishes two things. One, it gives us that flexibility, and another thing is it makes the idea of registering things consistent if services are always registering things with other services. Right now this is a method called register IPC handler, but this could also eventually be declarative as well if we decide that that's a good idea. I'm not really sure yet, but if I do this way, I don't have to be sure yet. So there we are. Now I can write a naive for loop where we actually, this doesn't even have to be a for loop. We have the event data message. I believe that's the name of the event. Yes. So if window.register, oh whoops, not register, it's just IPC handlers, right? If window IPC handlers has own property, has own properties just for paranoia's sake, really could just check if the key is truthy, because I know that the prototype of this object doesn't have anything weird on it, but for the sake of consistency and just because I want to, I'm going to use has own property. Has own property. The name message is what we're passing here. Whoops, sorry, I scrolled down kind of randomly there. If this exists, then that's our spec, window IPC handlers message. And if we have that spec, then we're going to call spec handler with some arguments. And I'm not sure what those arguments are yet. I know one of them is going to be app instance ID, and one of them is going, and some of them are going to come from the caller as well. So let's take a look at launchApp again. launchApp creates a child instance ID. So that's a responsibility of launchApp, of the caller of launchApp actually, which is a little odd actually. I feel like launchApp itself should be responsible for creating the ID of the app, but it seems to be called in a few places, so I don't want to change that, and there's not much of an advantage to changing that right now anyway. The caller can pass a UUID for now, that's fine. Actually, no, there is a way I can do that, but I don't know if launchApp will return the UUID yet, so I won't worry about that. Window child launch callbacks. So this is where we register this. We won't need to if I have this implemented the way I would like it to be. And then we call launch app. So I'm going to grab this over. I'm going to grab both of these over, all this code actually. And I'm not going to, actually, I'm going to copy that again into the A register in Vim. I'm not going to change anything yet. I'm going to register this with this IPC handlers registry and test it, make sure that's working, and then I'm going to proceed to do what I'm doing. And I will actually end up creating another service. And I am going to call this I shouldn't call it app service because that makes it seem like it's for querying what apps exist and that kind of thing. So maybe exec service, or I'll call it that for now. I can always change the name if I don't like it later. So for now it's called exec service. It could also be called launch app service, but I don't want to have that much granularity of the services right now. That seems a bit too much. It's just, for now, the only thing that's going to be in here is launch app. But this would be kind of the service for managing the instances of apps on the desktop. That's how I'm seeing this right now. The only way that concept is distinguished from process service is that right now we have processes that aren't apps. For example, when you open Task Manager, that's like a pseudo process, as in not a real process. Alright, so async init. we will use async in it in this case because we're going to use it to register the service. So we need to get the IPC handler service. I need to find a service that talks to other services, and I think one of these will. Service. Something here talks to other services. No, okay. I'm going to look in launch service and see how services are passed to other services. They're passed in it as an object called services. Okay, that works for me. Services. Services dot get. I believe it's dot get. Services has a dot get. IPC. And following the convention that I used in backend, this is SVC IPC as the variable name for IPC service. And we're going to register IPC handler. And this IPC handler will be called launchApp. This is something really interesting here. So I can paste this implementation in a handle method on here. Of course I can do that. I'm going to have to pass the parameters in here somehow as well. And then once there are a few of these things here, once we're registering more than one IPC handler, we can then start to do this in a more declarative way, working on the methods of XX service. So XX service will have a launch app method that does the task of launching an app, and we might say static expose. We might have a list of methods that we want to expose to IPC so that apps can call it, and then this can be done for any service once we implement that. And we can add parameters like this. We want to hide certain parameters. Don't send this one, right? We could have an argument that the apps aren't allowed to pass to this method and that sort of thing. And then instead of writing code to handle that situation where that code could actually be incorrect and introduce a vulnerability, the logic for doing that will be in one place, and if it's fixed there, it's fixed everywhere, that kind of thing. So that is the plan for the future, but I don't have to do that right now. One thing I'm going to do is ensure that this uses named parameters so that doing such a thing, identifying an argument by name instead of position, because you might reorder arguments, right, is possible. So let's do SVC IPC, and actually right now I can do this way. Launch app. So it's going to look a little redundant right now because we're not doing that declarative approach that I just mentioned, but that's just not necessary right now. So the handler is going to be this.launchApp.bind this. That just makes sure the this that's in this is that this, which is this, which is the XX service this. Semantic satiation is fun. Right, so launchApp roughly is going to look like that. This can stay the same because it's on the window object. This is why no abstractions is better than bad abstractions, because otherwise this would have been more difficult. Launch app, and then event. Do we want to vent? This is an interesting question all of a sudden. So another thing about this expose idea, actually, that I want to mention now that I'm looking at these arguments is we can also type these as well. So I could say launch app has parameters, and one of these parameters is app name, An app name could have a validator, and we might have some kind of registry of validators, and there's one for a valid app name, something like that. That might be a little too verbose. I'm sure there's a better way to do that right now, but the concept is good because we can implement that validation in one place. In fact, it might even just be regex, and something like a config.app regex. And the important thing about that is it lets us put that validation in place, and then any method anywhere in sort of the back end of the front end in these services can use that same validation. And that adheres to the don't repeat yourself principle very well, which is always a welcome thing when it doesn't hinder other things. All right, launchApp. We have event.data. Do we use anything else on event? No. So principle of least concern, we just get data here. Was it principle of least concern? It might be called something else, but that idea. Data and app name. App name is a parameter that we have, and args is a parameter that we have. Actually, this looks much better as app name and args, so I'm actually going to do that because these are truly the parameters of launchApp. So, all right, app name and args or empty object, parent instance ID. So now we have to decide how does launchApp get the information of whether it's being called by a service internally or by an app. We could prefix this with app, and we'd pass null anytime we call it internally. Or this could be IPC info. Or we could have a special parameter IPC info and our named parameters that's not a valid parameter name for iframes to pass over here. I'm not a huge fan of reserved words, and if someone makes a mistake on that somewhere, that would introduce a potential security pitfall, so I don't think that's a great idea. I think at the end here we have an object that's an optional object that's for any kind of thing that's supplemental to the parameters of the method call. So anything that's not the parameters of the method call, it's supplemental to it, that's telling us something about how this method was invoked or the context in which it was invoked. So it doesn't have to be passed. We don't have to pass an awkward null as the first parameter, that sort of thing. All right, so this is where we get our IPC context. And if it's there, we're called from IPC. All right. So this is going to be, I assume, if this is undefined, it just does nothing. It assumes it's a call from within the system, so that's going to be IPC context. Now I am actually curious if we do call launchApp without a parent app ID elsewhere in the system. Whoops, that's launchApp with an underscore. I assume we do, because if we call it internally, to open like an Explorer window, for example. Yeah, exactly. That's exactly what I was thinking, because why would we need to pass parent app ID? Perfect, okay. So this is, let's go back to IPC where this is actually called. This is going to be IPC context, and if that's not undefined, app instance ID. Cool. Child instance ID is the UUID we generate, and I'm keeping this the same for now. All of this is looking good so far. I don't need to delete this quite yet because it just won't run it if I hit any of these handlers. So now let's make the IPC context. IPC context is, what's that going to be? An object, and the object is going to have an app instance ID, which is going to be event.data.app instance ID. And we validate this, right? Yes, we do already validate that. We could eventually move the validation. Well, we can't move it in here because it's required by this. We could duplicate it over here, but I don't think that's necessary. I'm going to leave that be for the moment. And then I'm going to call this handler. So event.data. Those are our parameters to the handler. And we're going to give it some supplemental information about where it is called and what the context of that is, and that is IPC context. And that's there now. Are there any awaits here? No, but there's no reason not to make these capable of being asynchronous. Let's see if we have any asyncs in here. Doesn't really seem to be an issue for this, actually. So maybe these don't need to be asynchronous. I might find out that's incorrect in the future. Let me think about that. Yes, we do need these to be async. If we go back to my diagram, part of what we're doing over on this top half here is basically callback held, because we don't have that ability. That's just because things are implemented in different places and it was necessary, but as we get deeper into launchApp and how it's working, I have a feeling I'll find out that it's going to be possible to simply return the app information from here, which is just going to be the result. It doesn't know it's app information because this is a generic handler, but this does, so that's fine. All right. If I run this right now, in theory, it should work. Actually, I need a return here because this was handled over here. Let's see if there's any post steps to handling this, or if we just end at the end of this else if chain. There's no post steps, so I should be good to run this, and it should work. I'm going to add a console log here. Got message to new IPC handler, and just see if we got that message. And console.log end of that thing. These console logs aren't going to stay here. Actually, we could have a debug logger you can enable in the console that would show you these sorts of things, or we could send these to an event bus of some kind. We have that the ability to do that in one place now instead of at the beginning of each of these blocks had we wanted to do that before. And that's just one piece of flexibility. I don't know what else is going to come out of this, but history would tell me that there's going to be something I don't expect that we end up finding use in that I'm able to do because of that. So that is very cool. Init GUI says it's unsaved. What did I change here? Added, oh yes, we never finished registering IPC service because it didn't exist when I started typing that, and X6 service as well. So I'm gonna register X6 service as new X6 service. X6 service exposes its method to the IPC handler. I think I've got everything. Let's try to run Pewter and see what error message we get first, because as we know, things don't work on the first try. That's just not how things work. Alright. I probably didn't need to reload the server for that, actually, because this is all these are all changes in GUI. I am going to preemptively open the element inspector, expecting that this will fail. Let's see. The moment of... Okay. Failed to load script. Because 404 source definitions. That's not the error expected, but I think it's because VS Code forgot to add JS at the end of some imports. That's usually what that means. Hey, look at that. VS Code forgot to add JS at the end of some imports. It only knows to do that if it has a hint from a bunch of previous imports, and if it doesn't have that, it just... I don't know why it doesn't know that that's necessary. I think it thinks that it's Node.js side code instead of browser side code or something. I'm really not sure, but the introduction of ES6 modules did not go well, to say the least. Okay, we got our next error. Cannot read properties of undefined register IPC handler. That's because I called it PD instead of IPC. Because I am an inter-process dumbass. That's what that means. Let's see. IPC. C comes before D. It is more correct. In this particular instance, I'm going to move the server closer to DevTools because that's getting kind of annoying. All right. Well, I'm just going to let that fall through and then reload it. I did not need to restart the backend. I keep forgetting that. That has not been necessary either of the times that I've done it. Alright, GUI loads. That's a good sign, but true test is launching an app. Okay, yep, we do actually have an error. Window IPC handlers has own property, and message is not defined. This needs to be event.data.message, I believe, yeah. Event.data.message, IPC. Alright, let's reload that. This time I remembered not to reload the server because that would be silly. Okay, we opened with Notepad. I think that's a call to launchApp as well, but just to be sure. Okay, I also wanted to launch Explorer because Explorer is a different type of app. It's handled differently. Okay, let's do a file. I'm going to test with a file, and then I'm going to test opening an app from the terminal because I know that is a bit more complicated, or has potential for complications, because in this situation an app is calling launchApp, and look at that. I forgot to change this in the second place. So this code is only being tested. Really, no, not this code. This code inside the if is only being tested if launchApp is called from an iframe. So that's why it's important for me to test that case. Event.data.message. Let's see where else I'm going to screw that up. Spec. Event data.message. Looks good to me. Now I would put event.data.message into a symbol just called handler name or command name or something, but I think that's a mistake that's only going to be made by me in that moment because I typed message the first time. Child launch callbacks. Message ID is not defined. This was a symbol that I accidentally renamed and did not realize I renamed. So let's take a look at that. Message ID. You have to look at launchApp down here. And you see that message ID comes from somewhere above us. And it's used in a few places as well. So I'm going to go to the top of the file and scan down instead and see where we introduce message ID. Event.data.uuid. Okay. Let's see. That is part of our IPC context. Is that part of our IPC context? Yeah, this implies it's general for, oh, this is the ID for the callback. So for the moment, it is part of our IPC context, but in the future, instead of ever handling it here, IPC service, or the new handler in it, is going to handle that by itself. So I'm going to use XDRPC, the thing in util.js, and that is going to, we're just going to use await all the way up the rest of the chain. We're going to get a result back, and then that result we will return back to the caller. So that's going to be handled by XDRPC, and that's actually another thing that's really useful about having some code in one place for all the calls, which is true about this as well. But if we tried to implement that here, we'd break everything down here, so that wouldn't really work. Okay, I'm rambling now. Let's see if this works. Where is Pewter? It's really weird. When I see terminal at the beginning of the window, I actually think it's going to be a terminal. Did I turn the server off? I wound up saying pewter.localhost.com somehow. That's actually really funny. Right, let's get the DevTools open. LaunchApp. Reference error, LaunchApp is not defined. That's because LaunchApp is an import, and I didn't import it. Start typing it. It does see that it's from launchapp.js. Launchapp.js, that's another situation where I could move launchapp.js into Exec service, but it doesn't need to be moved in there. And in fact, I really like the fact that it's in a separate file like this, because LaunchApp is a pretty important part of the back end of the front end. And it would make much more sense in a folder alongside exec service, if services ever has subfolders, or if we have source/modules, which is the convention used in backend. I'm not actually sure which of those two conventions I like better, but it's trivial to change that. Even if I wanted to move all the modules in backend to folders and services, it would take it'd be less than an hour of work. So that's not something I'm concerned about. I'm going to do all the basic tests again that I already did, although it's really unlikely that there's anything breaking there. Terminal loaded, which actually means it did launch an app. It launched Phoenix, and I'm just going to, for sanity's sake, also try this. And that worked. And that looks like everything works. So now, now LaunchApp is over here. And this will enable me to slowly begin the process. Well, maybe not slowly, actually. This went pretty well and didn't take very long. So I'm just going to go through the process of dealing with this situation. I'm going to highlight that in blue here. Basically eliminating the need for, this too. All of this. Wait, not eliminating the need for a LaunchApp. That would be a little extreme. No. None of this is then necessary if we're using XDRPC, because that's really all this is doing. This awkward kind of jumping back into this object to get the ID that we post message to UI.js in Pewter.js in the iframe. We can look at that right now, actually. I'm going to close these editors. In helpers.js, that's where we have report app launched. And we can see it just checks if we have something registered in that object, and then if we do, we get the iframe, and then we post message with the iframe ID that we got. And then we make sure that that gets garbage collected because we're not going to reference that again. And that is all report app launched does. And we can, instead of having this awkward hop here, we can handle that in here. We already have the iframe that sent us the message, so we don't need to fetch that again. That will make things ever so slightly faster, but I don't really care about that, just more so that we're not writing the same code in multiple places to handle the same thing. Yeah, so this is it's gonna be really easy to get rid of all that, and then we just we'll probably keep that as is for now. I don't see any immediate reason to change any of that, and then it'll be almost as simple as my diagram for the ideal case, and I will have dealt with all of my concerns here. Until next time.